Military intelligence is defined as analyzed information from various sources that is processed in adequate time for commanders to make informed decisions and take whatever actions are required. History, however, is littered with events of failure in military intelligence. From the earliest records of time to the events of 9/11, commanders have been taken by surprise with predictable regularity. Surprise, after all, is one of the cardinal elements of war. A breakdown of military intelligence or failure to comprehend the imminent threat posed by the enemy will lead to military defeat. This was never more evident than in 1941 when the Japanese were perceived as simple people who were incapable of fighting, once he posed little danger. The commander in charge of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel, quickly learned firsthand that these perceptions of Japan were about to change. This is a documentary, A Broken Man to a Raging Tiger, Failure of Military Intelligence, The Actions and Legacy of Admiral Husband Kimmel. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, was sure to change the course of history. The bombings lasted just under 2 hours, yet Commander Admiral Kimmel spent the remaining 27 years of his life trying to expose the truth about Pearl Harbor. He bore responsibility of this fateful date. 2,403 Americans died under his watch, 1,178 were injured. 18 ships and about 170 aircraft were destroyed. Husband Edward Kimmel was born on the 26th of February, 1882, in Henderson, Kentucky. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1904. Before reaching his flag rank, he served in several battleships and commanded 2 destroyer divisions. In 1937, Kimmel was promoted to Rear Admiral and commanded several cruiser divisions. He became known as a very capable officer who believed in following rules and regulations to the letter. Due to Japan signing a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt felt that he needed to reorganize the Pacific Fleet. The Pacific Fleet was moved from California to Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. In February 1941, Kimmel became Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and the Pacific Fleet. Actions of Kimmel's life were centered on Pearl Harbor from the day he took command till the day he died. Upon arrival at Pearl Harbor, Kimmel had an inadequate military budget and a naval base with inferior equipment. The fleet was not ready for war. Kimmel intended to make them ready, so vigorous training was conducted throughout the fleet. The commander in charge of the Hawaiian Department at Pearl Harbor was Lieutenant General Walter C. Short. The intertwining of the command between the Navy and the Army at Pearl Harbor was understood between these 2 commanders. Both remote commanders relied on Washington to provide the vital link to the world that they needed. When asked about receiving necessary information from Washington, Kimmel's grandson Manning replied,
The ultimate responsibility would go to my grandfather's superior officer, the Chief of Naval Operations, a gentleman by the name of Admiral Harold Stark. And Stark was Admiral Kimmel's boss on several occasions when Kimmel traveled to Washington and demanded assurances that any intelligence that pertaining to Pearl Harbor would be given to him. His boss, Harold Stark, said, yes, that'll happen. Don't worry about it. We've got your back covered. And as it turns out, exactly the opposite occurred.
Diplomatic Tokyo radio broadcasts were decoded in Washington. Historians believe these magic intercepts alerted Roosevelt of an upcoming attack. Encrypted wind messages were also received, but not decoded until 4 years later, in 1945. While testifying to the Joint Congressional Committee investigation in 1946, Kimmel states that he nor Short had all the messages supplied to them by Washington.
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
Thomas Kimmel, Husband Kimmel's grandson, talks about June 17, 1940 intercept deceit plan.
Gave indications of the time and the place and the reason and the deceit plan to cover the Pearl Harbor attack. All of this information was available through the decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications available in Washington, D.C., but not sent to Admiral Kimmel.
Kimmel was not aware of this decipher until February 2, 1944, over 2 years too late for a response. With Japan changing its call signals frequently, the U.S. War Department proposed Kimmel send U.S. carriers, 25 planes, and Marines to Midway. Little did Kimmel know, but there's evidence that the harbor had been divided into 5 sub-areas, and the Japanese had mapped and coded all vessels with up-to-the-minute fleet movement in and out of the harbor. The December 6th pilot message stating Japan's concerns was sent. Washington received 13 pages of a 14-page letter. After reading, Roosevelt knew war was coming, but didn't know where. This was in hand by midnight Washington time, or 7 p.m. December 6th, Hawaii time. Roosevelt wanted to resolve conflict. His note was held back in Japan for 10.5 hours. The 14th page of the letter, which implied war, was sent by Japan and received by Stark by 9 a.m., Washington, D.C. time, December 7th. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, was given instructions to send another war warning message to Kimmel and Short. Due to radio interference, he sent it as a cable and it wasn't marked urgent. Hawaii was out of time. Mobile radar station Opana picked up a large number of planes by privates George Elliott and James Lockhart, who relayed this information to Army Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, who believed these planes were B-17s brought into Hawaii from California. Tyler told the privates not to worry and took no action. These two watched the radar for another 30 minutes before they turned it off. Even with these radar blips and the sinking of a midget sub at 6:45 a.m., the atmosphere around Pearl Harbor was not ready for war. As the first wave of planes flew low over the harbor, eyewitnesses could see the whites of the pilots' eyes, their mustache, or even a wave hello. As U.S. battleships were moored along Battleship Row, the Japanese dive bombers attacked airfields including Ford Island at about 7:55 a.m. This attack prompted the dispatch of the famous message, "Air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is no drill," the outside world's first indication that war had come to the Pacific. Kimmel looked upon the ruins of the harbor and thought it would have been easier if he'd been hit by the bullets too. Pearl Harbor was but the bloody beginning of what was yet an endless tale of woe and the beginning of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous speech to Congress declaring war on Japan December 8, 1941. Kimmel's actions, including having battleships moored in the harbor, not conducting long-distance reconnaissance, failure to know that Pearl Harbor was the chosen site, and level of readiness were called into question. 7 days later, investigations began on who was responsible for this attack. Fingers were pointed directly at Short and Kimmel. Both were relieved of duty 10 days later. By December 16, 1941, FDR appointed a commission headed by Associate Owen J. Roberts of the Supreme Court. The fact-finding commission presented their findings to Congress within 37 days and declared both men guilty of dereliction of duty. Kimmel was a broken man. Kimmel and Short were forever labeled as scapegoats, even with testimony exonerating them. It wasn't until a visit on February 21, 1944, by Naval Intelligence Officer Captain Lawrence Safford that Kimmel learned of the admitted Japanese deciphers. Kimmel became enraged and empowered to clear his name. The Raging Tiger was born. Of the 10 investigations since the attack, only one found the men guilty. The Naval Court of Inquiry completely exonerated Kimmel. Others found errors in judgment and felt that they both should share the same blame. No court-martials ever held. Through Kimmel's actions, the facts of Pearl Harbor are still unfolding. Today, commanders demand all intelligence available and Washington officials are held accountable. Kimmel died on May 14, 1968 in Groton, Connecticut. Kimmel and Short are the only two flag and general officers who have not been restored to their wartime 4-star rank. After the 2001 Defense Authorization Act passed, both were exonerated and Congress asked the President to restore their stars. The Pearl Harbor Survivors Association and a host of others have also endorsed this recommendation. Up to date, no president has acted upon this request. Admiral Charles explains,
And those presidents and secretaries of defense, none of them have believed that the Navy was persuaded that sufficient meritorious grounds existed to put Rear Admiral Kimmel on the Admiral list in retirement.
the events of 9/11 may have affected the controversy of Kimmel. The parallels drawn between the two events and Americans' unpreparedness in anticipating attacks upon U.S. soil make it unlikely the President will initiate posthumous promotion. His family still fights. Military information available after the Pearl Harbor attack has been slowly processed and released. Historians today believe blame should be spread among officials. This evolution of these historical truths has clouded the legacy of Admiral Husband Kimmel. Did he fight for historical truths for prosperity while withstanding undeserved humiliation? Did his fights for the release of all military intelligence ensure all commanders will have the necessary information supplied to them in times of conflict? Was he a military man trying to restore his name and honor? Was he a scapegoat for Washington officials? Maybe Kimmel's legacy was all of the above.